Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's program. We will begin in just a couple minutes. Hang tight, and we will be right back. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us for Ask Me, our educational webinar series. My name is Steve Goklowski, Vice President of Care Services at the ALS Network. Next slide, please. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, ALS Bio News Today, and our accessibility and inclusivity sponsor, Tanabe Pharma America, as well as our mission benefactor families and everyone who helps support our programming. Programs like this, as well as the services we provide, are made possible through these generous donations. Now and always, we want to ensure that you know that the ALS Network offers a menu of services free of charge to people with ALS and their families. Please note that if you need a piece of equipment loaned to you, emotional support or counseling, assistance with finding home care, help understanding insurance benefits, guidance in finding an ALS specialist for care or a clinical trial, or just someone with expertise to answer any other questions about the disease, the ALS Network is here for you. Our committed staff, who are locally based in California and Hawaii, provide high quality, personalized, and local services, as we also fight on the legislative advocacy front and build our growing research program. We are your local team, and we are glad to provide multi layered support. To learn more about the ALS Network and programs and services we provide, please visit us at www.alsnetwork.org for more information. Today's program will be hosted by ALS United President and CEO Jerry Dawson. I'll now hand things over to Jerry, who will introduce our speakers. Take it away, Jerry.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening, everyone. My name is Jerry Dawson. I'm the President and CEO of ALS United, and I'm genuinely honored to be with you tonight. Whether you're joining us from the East Coast in the middle of your afternoon or out west on your lunch break in Hawaii, wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. And ALS United is a federation of 15 independent nonprofit organizations serving people living with ALS across the country. Our vision is very simple. Together, we end ALS. That vision guides everything that we do, from the care we provide every single day to the research we believe will one day make this disease history. We serve more than half of the U.S. ALS population, and our members are embedded in nearly 100 multidisciplinary ALS clinic teams nationwide. We show up for people impacted by this disease locally, personally, and directly. And we invest deeply in the science that will one day make this work unnecessary. Both of those commitments brought us here today. Our members fought hard for the original Act for ALS, and reauthorization is our top advocacy priority today, along with protecting the research infrastructure and that this legislation built. That same commitment led us to become investors in the public-private partnership component of AMP-ALS, one of the most ambitious collaborative research efforts in ALS history. I'm proud to represent ALS United on the AMP-ALS Steering Committee and our members participate in all of the working groups. Tonight's conversation is one we are deeply invested in. Here's what I want you to know before we get started. Act for ALS is not a bureaucratic program, it is a lifeline. It created pathways for people with ALS to access treatments that would otherwise be out of reach. It funded research infrastructure that didn't exist before, and it expires on September the 30th of this year. Before we dive in, I want to take just a moment to set the stage for this presentation. The purpose of this webinar is to walk through the history and development of the Act for ALS, provide context on how it has been implemented, and give you an opportunity to ask the experts your questions directly. Our intent tonight is not to debate the merits of the law. It is to make sure that everyone on this call leaves better informed and better equipped to have meaningful conversations with members of Congress. That's the goal. We want you walking away tonight knowing the facts, knowing the story, and knowing what you can do next. Tonight you're going to hear from 5 of the most knowledgeable people in the ALS community. They're going to walk you through what this law has done, why it matters, and what we need to do right now to make sure it doesn't go away. Let me introduce you to our panelists. First, Andrea Pauls-Backman is the founder of ALS Strategy Consulting. She came to this work as a caregiver for her mother, who passed from ALS. She previously served as CEO of the Les Turner ALS Foundation and as a national trustee for the ALS Association. She currently serves on working groups for AMP-ALS and on the steering committee for the All-ALS Consortium. Andrea will walk us through the history of the Act for ALS and how it has shaped what exists today. Next, Dr. James Berry is Associate Chair of Neurotherapeutics and Chief of the Division of ALS and Motor Neuron Diseases at Mass General Brigham. He directs the MGH Neurological Clinical Research Institute, oversees the NEALS Biorepository, and is a lead principal investigator of the All-ALS Consortium. Dr. Berry will speak to the All-ALS program and what it has made possible. Dr. Jinsey Andrews is Director of the ALS Center and Director of Clinical Trials at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. She is the elected co-chair of NEALS, the International ALS Clinical Trial Consortium of more than 150 specialty centers worldwide. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Neurology and a fellow of the American Neurological Association. Dr. Andrews will share what it looks like to administer the expanded access programs, including the data they've gathered and the infrastructure that has been built as a result. Dr. Stacy Lewin-Farber is an ALS advocate and a former obstetric anesthesiologist who was diagnosed with ALS in February of 2021. She is a NEALS research ambassador, a consumer reviewer for the Department of Defense Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, and a board member of the ALS Hope Foundation. She and her husband Dan have fundraised hundreds of thousands of dollars for ALS research and have lobbied at both the state and federal level. Dr. Lewin-Farber will share what the expanded access programs have meant from the inside. And finally, Allison Nadeau is co-chair of ALS United's Advocacy Committee and Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at one of ALS United's members, the ALS Network, where she leads advocacy efforts at the national level and state level to advance policies that improve access to care for people living with ALS. Allison has been a critical partner in building the Reauthorization Coalition, and she will close tonight's program by telling us exactly where we stand in 2026 and what comes next. These 5 people represent the full arc of this work: the science, the policy, the lived experience, and the road ahead. So let's get started. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, let's get started. The Act for ALS, as it's commonly known, has a formal name. It is the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies, that's where the Act comes from, for ALS. So let's talk a little bit about why this was necessary. Prior to 2021, ALS research was still largely siloed. We did not have sufficient federal collaboration and coordination between the community, researchers, industry sponsors, and the agencies, which we refer to as the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Additionally, with no disease-modifying treatment at that time, treatment options were very limited for nearly all people living with ALS. And the large majority of people living with ALS did not qualify for clinical trials and did not have access to a clinical trial site near their homes. So as Jerry said, the Act for ALS was designed to bridge a critical gap in ALS research and care. It provided a pathway to expand access to investigational treatments while building the scientific structure and creating pathways to move therapies to approval faster. So let's look at how the Act for ALS was crafted to bridge this critical gap. Now, legislative language can be clunky, so I'm not going to read this slide. I'm going to summarize the salient concepts here. The Act for ALS provided certain funding streams to NIH and to FDA to do several things. The first was to establish the first federally funded expanded access programs known as EAPs. This is for ALS. These NIH-funded EAPs are designed to provide investigational therapies to people who do not qualify for clinical trials. And only investigational therapies from small biotech companies could qualify for funding. The purpose of these EAPs, in addition to creating access, was to generate real-world data to better understand underrepresented populations in ALS. The Act also was designed to build a coordinated national research infrastructure. This is accessible and is accessible now, as we'll see, through a shared knowledge portal. The purpose here was to connect federal agencies, scientists, advocacy organizations to streamline how potential treatments are studied, how they're shared, and how they're advanced to approval. Now, the Act was also able to provide large-scale data and biospecimen collection. This creates unified platforms for harmonizing and sharing information and biological samples to accelerate discovery, improve clinical trial design, and reduce duplication across ALS research efforts. Now, you'll see in this language, there are two specific funding mechanisms that were directed to the FDA. The first was to create a new 5-year action plan to advance development of safe and effective drugs for people with ALS and other rare neurodegenerative diseases. There was also a program to create a new FDA R&D, rare neurodegenerative disease, grant program to fund remote clinical outcome assessments, diagnostic biomarkers, and tools to enhance development of devices in rare neurodegenerative disease. Now, as Jerry mentioned, this legislation expires September 30th of this year, and the reauthorization is subject to the findings of a GAO report that was released about 6 weeks ago, and obviously subject to a congressional vote. So next slide, please. So excuse me for a second here. This is the research ecosystem for ALS. This graphic is very simplistic, but it really shows how these various programs are connected. And I want to talk a little bit about each of them because, frankly, when people look at this, they see alphabet soup. There are a lot of acronyms here. On the EAPs, so if you look at the top, the NIH EAP program is something that Dr. Andrews is going to go into more detail a little bit later in this webinar. But what I will let you know right now is that 5 investigational therapies have been funded under this program, 2 of which are currently or shortly will be in phase 3 studies. Moving along this diagram, taking a look at the FDA's 5-year action plan has been completed. In fact, I think a new one is going to be underway, assuming the bill is reauthorized. And this action plan, along with the FDA grant program, was designed to accelerate the pipeline toward drug development. Moving along the diagram on the left, the public-private partnerships was an interesting program in ALS. So these are programs that have existed in other diseases. And those existing models were used to implement the provisions provided under the Act for ALS. So as we move to the next slide, we'll see what those look like. So first of all, I want to thank the FNAH, the Foundation for NIH, for this slide. It is very busy. I am not going to read all of it, but I think it is a really good snapshot at how these programs work together. So the Act for ALS created new collaborations. And if you look at the top of this slide, you'll see NIH and FDA alongside each other that are providing input and providing fundings into these collaborations. And at the very top of the slide are people with lived experience. These are people living with ALS, people who may have lost a loved one to ALS, but really it is the input of these three groups working together that provides the guidance and the advice toward these programs. So Act for ALS allowed NIH and FDA to design this comprehensive strategy. So I want to start over on the left, CPR&D. I'm going to spell this out because, again, this looks like a lot of acronyms. CPR&D is the Critical Path Rare Neurodegenerative Disease Program. The Critical Path Institute, which is known as CPATH, is a nonprofit. It has worked with FDA in many disease spaces. CPR&D was founded in September, I believe, of 2022, so shortly after the act was signed, with the goal of leading collaborations that advance treatments to improve the lives of people affected by rare neurodegenerative disease, including ALS. CPR&D's role under the Act for ALS has been really twofold. The first is to harmonize existing clinical data sets. And the second one has been to develop new patient-informed clinical outcome assessments. In ALS, we desperately need new assessments because this will help us optimize clinical trials and clinical care. If we can better measure how people are progressing, we can provide better care and better evaluate investigational treatments. Moving over to the right, the AMP-ALS program is another collaborative effort. It's made possible by the expertise and the funding provided by various partners, including pharma companies and many ALS organizations across the country. And it has robust PWLE, or persons with lived experience, participation. The AMP-ALS program here is focused on biomarker discovery and validation, data integration and data analysis, including digital health technology-based biomarkers. Moving on to the bottom of this diagram, all ALS, which Dr. Berry is going to speak about shortly, is the largest harmonized longitudinal ALS clinical data set, comprising all stages of ALS, including pre-symptomatic people at risk for ALS, as well as people currently living with the disease and controls. Now, all of this data, and you'll see how they intersect, but all the data gathered by these programs is being deposited into what is known as the ALS Knowledge Portal. You'll see at the very bottom of the slide. This was launched in August of 2025, and I put a little QR code there, which will take you directly to the portal. This currently has 20 plus data sets that have previously been generated in ALS that have been harmonized, and it includes new data coming through the All ALS program. So I'm going to close this piece of the presentation by saying AMP-ALS very much wants to keep the community informed of the work that it's doing. It has created a newsletter, and you can sign up to receive regular updates going to the FNIH website. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Jerry.
Thank you, Andrea. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. James Berry to talk about the All ALS program that the Act made possible. Dr. Berry?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jerry, and thanks, Andrea. Um, so I'm excited to talk about the All ALS Consortium. I think this is something that's really, really exciting that's come out of Act for ALS. It's really given us a focus, and we've been able to think bigger than we ever have before about the natural history of ALS in conjunction with biomarkers, digital health technologies, and sort of a growing number of outcome measures and medical history elements that we're adding to the All ALS Consortium data set. And then all of that will be shared broadly, as you'll see in a moment. Next slide. So all ALS sort of stands for Access for All in ALS. The name is actually meant to be sort of analogous to the name All FTD, which is a similar broad multi-center NIH-funded biomarker and natural history study in frontotemporal dementia. And we know that these diseases share some biology. We've shared a lot of information about methodology back and forth between these studies. Some participants are shared between these studies, and our biofluids are shared in the same biorepository, same location, so that we can really continue to learn about both diseases at the same time. But all ALS itself was created as a part of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for ALS, or AMP-ALS, that you just heard about. And this is funded by ACT for ALS. This really came out of really broad community conversations, including people with lived experience as well as researchers, to say, what would help us move the field forward? And knowing more about the disease, understanding the natural history, having genetics and genomics on a large group of people collected alongside clinical information, along with biofluids, really rose to the top. And that's what this consortium is doing. And it is a sort of a consortium of 36 clinical centers across the US, including Puerto Rico. We have 2 coordinating centers. There are a huge number of people who are working on this in really close collaboration to make it go forward. And it has spun up very quickly and become the largest natural history biomarker study that we have, and certainly by far the fastest enrolling. Through the All ALS Consortium, we collect and share data and biological samples with researchers around the world. So just to give you a sense, all of the samples that are collected, all of them go to a central repository that is accessible by researchers writing sort of an access application that goes to a biorepository committee that then just makes sure that there's good science being done and the samples are sent out. Now they're all sent out under careful scientific agreements to be sure that people are using this in a way that's moving science forward. The data is also stored in a centralized database called the ALS Knowledge Portal. And the ALS Knowledge Portal was really built with all ALS in mind, but is also bringing in existing data from multiple other studies, so that it's not just all ALS data that will be there, but ALS data from many existing studies and from expanded access programs that you'll hear about from GENSI, so that all of that data can be combined and then used very powerfully to understand the disease at various stages, look for biomarkers, and understand subgroups of patients and all of these things that we've talked about, but really didn't have a centralized resource to do this with. And all of this is made possible by ACT for ALS. Next slide. So this is a site map. The sites that are participating in this study were really selected to cover as much geography as we could. There have been a couple of sites that have left the consortium, and a few more actually more than a few more that have started the consortium since the beginning. We're always looking for ways to make this more accessible to people who might participate in the study, and having a broad set of sites was really important for that. In addition to having sites as broadly spread out as we can, we also wanted to design the study so that it would allow people to enroll even if they were in a site, a state that didn't have a center, or a large state that had a center but that was located far from them. Next slide. And so we have designed a few different cohorts. For people living with ALS, they can participate on site, that is, come to their clinic or the participating center about every 4 months, and they would do that over 2 years. Or they can participate fully remotely. That means that their consent can be done remotely. That means they can be at home, but remote from the site, and a site can enroll them in the study. And they can do all of their follow-up visits. And in fact, blood will be collected by having a home phlebotomy unit dispatched to their home to collect their blood. We really haven't done this at this scale in this disease ever before. Certainly, we have done smaller studies this way. The pandemic really paved the way for us to be able to do this in some ways, but we're really capitalizing on that and sort of changing the way that we can do studies. So that's really exciting, and it's something that is incredibly important. Now, when people participate on site, we also ask them if they're willing to give us spinal fluid. Spinal fluid is incredibly important as a fluid to analyze to look for biomarkers, because one of the challenges in ALS is that we can't actually get to tissue from the brain or spinal cord. The closest we can get is spinal fluid, and that gives us great insight. And then we can extend those findings into the blood, just as we did with neurofilament, now a very widely used biomarker. We developed that in the spinal fluid, then went to the blood, and were able to hone that assay. So we now can just test blood. Now, if we're going to have people living with ALS in the study, we also need people who don't have ALS, who are sometimes referred to as controls. At this point, controls are participating just on site so that we can get a very well-characterized group of controls. And we're actually expanding the way that we collect blood and clinical data from controls and even spinal fluid going forward. That's a change that we're going to make to the protocol to allow some controls to give us more frequent biofluids so that we'll have a better comparison to people living with ALS. And finally, we have a cohort that's called the Prevent All ALS, which is enrolling people who are potentially at increased risk of developing ALS because of genetics. And I say potentially because they may or may not know their own genetic status, but they might know that they come from a family where their risk is increased. That's actually done, so at least once a year they're seen on site, and then there are also visits that are done at home remotely throughout the year. We have already enrolled almost 1,500 participants. Our goal is to get to over 2,000 participants and do that really in short order in the next 6 months. Again, much faster enrolling than any of the other studies that we've done in ALS. And that's what we can do when we have this whole consortium working for a single goal. Next slide. Oh, okay. So that's my last slide. I guess what I would say is that all ALS is possible because of the vision, because of the hard work that the community, that people living with ALS, that people with lived experience put in to fund Act for ALS. It happens alongside our expanded access programs. The two are benefiting from happening concurrently. We're often using or proposing using all ALS samples as sort of comparator samples for expanded access programs and vice versa. All of the data is going to the same place. This is really an opportunity we have never seen in the field before, and all that's made possible because of Act for ALS. And I can't say enough about what this means for researchers in the field broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Barry. That was wonderful. Dr. Jinsey Andrews has been on the front lines of administering these programs. Dr. Andrews, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a brief opportunity. I have given a couple of updates on the expanded access program that I'm the principal investigator for, but I just wanted to share a little bit more of a bigger picture here on some details of where we are on expanded access that are funded through the NIH. So if you can go to the next slide, I think it's really important. So I have been the principal investigator of the CNM-AU8 program that's offered through expanded access. There are other programs that have been funded through NIH, including the Pridopidine and the RAPA 501 expanded access programs. And those were all funded around the same time at the end of 2023. 2024 was Ibutolast. And so it has taken some time to gather all the details and all the data from these programs. And this year, you'll start to hear more about some of the outcomes. I think people have anxiously been waiting to hear about what are we learning. And so I think one of the things that I want to highlight, which was brought up by Andrea and both James, is that the expanded access program. So first, I want to take one step back. A lot of people ask why these drugs. So these drugs have to demonstrate strong safety and tolerability profiles. And so all of the ones that have been screened and put in through the NIH-funded Expanded Access Program demonstrate that. They do have to have some preliminary signal of benefit and have to qualify for opening an investigational new drug for a phase 3 trial. So, or a phase 2 trial. So that means that they've shown some preliminary effect and they have strong enough scientific rationale to be tested in people with ALS. And lastly, they have to have a concurrent intermediate expanded access application also approved through the FDA in order to administer an expanded access program. So those have to be in place before you even put in a grant application. When you put the grant application in, you do have to specify not only the request to administer an investigational drug that qualifies to people with living with ALS, but you also have to establish specific research questions. So it's not just about the drug and the safety and tolerability and potential data to evaluate its efficacy in a more advanced population of people living with ALS, but you have to ask some research questions. So when you do it, you can ask about biomarkers, you can ask about wearable digital devices like actigraphy or speech. You can ask about looking at virtual predicted algorithms. And so there's a lot of questions you can ask that normally you wouldn't do in a pivotal phase 3 that's run by a drug company just to get to the finish line for FDA final approval. So that's where the learnings occur in expanded access. So some of those examples, Clean not only will be testing some of those exploratory biomarkers and gathering data so that we might be able to evaluate and use it in a more formal setting in a clinical trial in the future, but they also did a feasibility of doing a fully remote enrollment across the United States. And this is really gaining access. There was a paper that was just published looking at trying to reach those people that don't get to sites. We have preliminary data from the baseline demographics from the Clean Expanded Access Program that's funded through the NIH that I'm the principal investigator for. We did a couple of abstracts at the end of last year where we looked at the cohort that was enrolled virtually versus the ones that were enrolled in the academic setting. And the cohort that was enrolled virtually actually came from a more socioeconomically disadvantaged background. And they also were very isolated from a particular specialty center or research center for ALS. So as far as, I think we had one participant as far as more than 2,000 miles from a research center. Predopidine actually helped to build new sites and bring up smaller sites and community hospital sites to participate in research and provide expanded access and investigational products. And RAPA 501 has broadened the number of centers that can actually expand into this expertise and really bridging neurology and hematology oncology to give cell therapy. And so these learnings have really helped to set up like an infrastructure for more research in the future. If you can go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. So we did actually ask our own sites in the NEALS network some specific questions related to Act for ALS and the NIH-funded expanded access programs. So we asked, has participating in the NIH-funded EAP or all ALS helped build your site's capacity for ALS research? So remember, ALS centers, they are not as big as other disease organization centers. And so about half of our centers did state that the funding from the Act for ALS and that went to NIH-funded EAPs or all ALS helped expand their own internal research capacity. And about 25% of those sites said that this was their first opportunity to provide investigational product through expanded access at their sites. So it broadened expertise within these ALS research centers within the NEALS network. If you go to the next slide, the All ALS, many of you in the community already know how important this initiative is, and All ALS was built and leveraged the sites that actually were participating in the expanded access programs with the goal of trying to expand as much geographic access as possible. So inherently, these expanded access programs have helped leverage an infrastructure not only to expand, but also be efficient. So these first round of EAPs will help bring efficiencies, hopefully, for the future. We've learned a lot from them. And there were definitely challenges. There were definitely opportunities. And I think there's a way that we can kind of learn from these and move forward. If you can go to the next slide, a couple of things. People say, what have you learned from these EAPs? And like I said, the data is coming. One of those was like the demographic data from people that are virtually enrolled or from who are enrolled through a decentralized method. But we were able to test flexible study designs with options for remote visits. In these EAPs, across all of them, we're able to evaluate novel digital outcome measures, and we're able to collect longitudinal clinical data and biomarker samples. These are really important, and connecting the clinical data with the biomarker samples, super important to learn about the cohorts and subtypes of ALS. And so that basic science researchers can do very specific evaluations from those samples and clinical data and validate better targets so we can get better drugs into clinical trials. And it is happening actually concurrently. A lot of people say, oh, the funding, shouldn't we be funding more phase 1, phase 2 trials? But if you just go, I just did a search literally an hour ago in clinicaltrials.gov, there's about 228 programs that are active, that are recruiting or not yet recruiting for ALS specifically, and they're device, observational, or interventional studies. Now, if you look at the interventional studies, phase 1 and phase 2, almost 80% of the studies are phase 1 and phase 2, and majority of the studies are recruiting. Now, the problem is that maybe 20%, 10 to 20% of people that come through the door, especially in the United States, are not clinical trial eligible as our criteria becomes more stringent. So whether it's looking for a specific target or a marker to enroll in a clinical trial, or whether the clinical trial eligibility criteria is so narrow that they're not eligible because they've had symptoms for a long duration, or they might have impairments in other areas that doesn't allow them to be eligible. So majority of people who may want to access investigational drug don't have an opportunity. And so here's an opportunity where we're able to leverage the learnings from EAPs by feeding into an infrastructure, building the actual clinical research infrastructure, learning from biomarkers and experimental outcome measures, while we try to provide service for the majority of people who don't actually have a chance to participate in a clinical trial. So these are research. I think it's almost kind of a misnomer to call it an NIH-funded EAP program. These are kind of NIH-funded research programs. They have full data monitoring for validity and reliability. They are collecting functional outcomes, biomarker outcomes. We are employing regulatory standards for monitoring safety, having steering committees, safety committees like traditional clinical trials. And so they are trying to build this bridge in answering the needs of people living with ALS today, while trying to answer the needs for people who are going to be diagnosed with ALS in the future. If you go to the next slide, I think this is the last, I think this might be the last slide. I'm just going to reiterate that there's a synergy among all these programs with all ALS and future NIH-funded expanded access programs. So as James mentioned, regarding all ALS, NIH-funded EAPs will also collect samples and clinical information in a standardized, same way across all programs. They are going to the same repository that's scalable, sustainable, and maintained by the NIH. They are going to be open and available for researchers across all specialty areas for basic science research, and also be able to be identified through a standardized labeling through using a global unique identifier called NeuroGUID. So if you go to the next slide, I'll conclude there and pass it on to the wonderful Dr. Lewin-Farber to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Andrews. So now we've heard the science and the infrastructure, and now I want you to hear directly from a person living with ALS, Dr. Stacy Lewin-Farber.
Hello, I am Stacy Lewin-Farber.
And I am Stacy's husband, Dan Farber. I will be Stacy's voice this evening as we share our thoughts. We are grateful to ALS Network for hosting this important webinar, and are honored to be part of the panel of experts we admire and respect tremendously. Including the patient voice in the conversation is valuable. It is our voices that helped get the Act for ALS passed in 2021. Stacy is in her 6th year of living with ALS, emphasis on living with, and not dying from. Some might say we are living on borrowed time with a disease in which the average life expectancy is 2 to 5 years. We prefer to think of it as reclaiming our lives from ALS. Since diagnosis, Stacy has transitioned from physically taking care of our family and her patients to herself needing complete care. She has channeled her energy, medical knowledge, and lived experience as a patient into ALS advocacy. We live with intention, the intention to help the progress of ALS, research for successful treatments. The Act for ALS has enabled us to do this. Stacy participates in numerous observational studies. We have not been eligible to be part of a traditional drug trial for quite some time. The NIH-funded EAP program has given us the opportunity to have access to the experimental treatment, pridopidine, and contribute data in a meaningful way. Our EAP is offered through our clinic. However, one of the EAPs has been offered remotely, enabling broader availability for those unable to attend a brick and mortar establishment. We know the EAP drug has completed earlier phase studies and is promising enough to plan a phase 3 trial that Stacy would not be eligible for. Through the EAP, we, along with other patients enrolled in EAPs, can supply data representative of a population previously unstudied, those in the later stages of ALS. Of course, we are hopeful that the treatment we are taking is beneficial. The key word here is hopeful. The Act for ALS has provided hope that the novel approach it has added to research might support earlier access to meaningful treatments. The collaboration and transparency through data sharing that the Act has fostered is crucial. And we don't have time to lose momentum now. No one battling ALS has the time. Thank you for your time to hear our perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Lewin Farber and Dan. We appreciate that. That is exactly why we're here tonight. So next up and last speaker here is Allison Nadeau, who is going to bring us to the present moment where we are in 2026 and what the community needs to do right now. So Allison.
Thank you, Jerry, for the introduction, and thank you to all of our speakers for helping us walk through how this legislation has taken shape over the past 5 years. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to zoom out a bit and connect the dots across what we've heard and look at what this work has made possible and where things stand right now. Taken together, 3 themes stand out. The first is research. The legislation helps support the development of a broader research infrastructure for ALS, including large-scale studies like All ALS that we learned about from Dr. Berry, public-private partnerships that bring researchers and industry together, which was highlighted by Andrea, and efforts at the FDA that strengthen the scientific and regulatory foundation for evaluating potential therapies. The second theme is access. Through expanded access programs, people living with ALS who may not be eligible for traditional clinical trials have had opportunities to receive investigational therapies, like our own Dr. Stacy. At the same time, these programs are designed to collect real-world data that may help inform future research, as highlighted by Dr. Andrews. And the third theme is collaboration. One of the notable aspects of this work has been the level of coordination across government agencies, researchers, clinicians, industry partners, advocacy organizations, and most importantly, people living with ALS. Many programs and groups across the ALS community have been involved in really shaping this work. All of that taken together, these initiatives represent a broader effort to build infrastructure, to expand opportunities, and to strengthen collaboration in the ALS field across the country, and as we learned, internationally. So with that context in mind, the question becomes, where are we right now? There are three key things happening to this point. The first I want to highlight is the understanding of the impact of this legislation. As mentioned previously, earlier this year, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, released an independent review of how the legislation has been implemented. The report notes that many of these initiatives are still in the early stages, meaning it's too soon to draw definitive conclusions about their overall impact. However, it's important to note that at the same time, it highlights the significant progress that has been made in launching these efforts, including the expanded access programs operating across multiple clinical sites, the opportunities for remote participation that weren't available previously, and as Dr. Jinsey noted, were hitting more diverse communities, and then new research collaborations that are beginning to generate insights for the entire ALS field. And I do have exciting news to share that the first data set from the AMP ALS Knowledge Portal is heading toward publication and will be available in the coming months. The second thing I want to talk about is the strong community engagement. Organizations across the ALS space have come together to form a working group that includes advocacy leaders, researchers, clinicians, and people living with ALS, including several of our fellow panelists today. This group created a space that openly discussed what has been working, where challenges remain, and the improvements that could strengthen the overall implementation of the Act. Those conversations helped ensure that lived experiences were reflected alongside the findings of the GAO report. And they also informed discussions with congressional offices so that policymakers were hearing directly about what we were learning on the ground with the community. Organizations like the ALS Network and ALS United and other groups that are on the ground are uniquely positioned in these discussions because we work directly with the people living with ALS and their families every day through the care and support that we provide locally. That one-to-one connection really helps to ensure that those perspectives are shared in these policy conversations and they reflect the real experiences from across the country. And then the last bucket. We are building momentum for the next phase of this work. Bipartisan champions who helped to lead the original legislation remain actively engaged, and organizations and community members have been in close dialogue with these offices as discussions around reauthorization continue to move forward. Exciting news, we expect a bill to be introduced in the coming weeks. And once that happens, there will be an opportunity for members of the community, like those of you participating in this webinar, to stay informed. And if you choose to, you can reach out to your member of Congress about supporting this legislation. We will share important details in the follow-up to this webinar so participants know when these opportunities arrive and then how you can get involved. Because the current authorization expires in September 2026, the coming months are the most important time for advocates to stay engaged and to share their experiences with policymakers so that those experiences remain at the center of the discussion and the decisions that shape research, care, and access to therapies, particularly in a disease where time is not a luxury that people have. So thank you all for your time. And Jerry, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Allison. We invite everyone to type your questions directly in the chat area, but before we open it up, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the questions that came in ahead of today's webinar. We received questions through registration, and Andrea also shared questions that came in from the ALS community on social media. We read every single one of them, and there was a lot of overlap. Rather than run through each question individually, we just don't have the time. I've grouped them by theme so we can get to as much as possible in the time that we have. If your specific question isn't called out word for word, I want you to know it shaped how we are approaching this conversation. Nothing was set aside. So panelists, if you can please turn on your cameras, let's get into it. So the first question I have here would be directed to Dr. Andrews and Dr. Berry. So two related questions came in on this. For people currently in EAPs that are ending, are they eligible to participate in new EAPs under a reauthorized Act for ALS? And more broadly, what is being done to expand access for people who don't have a genetic marker and aren't already connected to a participating clinic?
Sure, it's a great question. I'll start, and then Jinsey, maybe you can fill in the pieces that I inevitably will forget here. So I think the first question is, if people have participated in one EAP, would they be excluded from participating in an EAP, in the future if the Act for ALS is reauthorized? And the answer is EAPs are really meant to be broadly applicable, unless there's a safety reason that someone can't be treated in serial using, with one drug followed by another drug. Unless there is a safety reason that can't happen, which is very rare, people would be eligible, whether they've participated in a trial in the past or an EAP in the past, or have not participated in a trial or an EAP in the past. These are really meant to be very, very broadly accessible to the population. I think that the second part of the question is a really exciting piece of sort of updates for science in ALS trials and EAPs in general, and that is sort of, what's happening in the space of sort of ALS that's not genetically determined. We know that we've had the incredible breakthrough of tofersen for people with SOD1 ALS, and that's an antisense oligonucleotide. It's a gene-targeted therapy. And we have other ones that are really promising in the pipeline. The FUS trial is going on, and I think we're all very excited to see that. There are other genetic therapies aimed at genetic forms of ALS. At the same time, we now have a gene therapy in the Vector E program that is using gene therapy to target TDP-43, the central molecule in ALS, in people with sporadic forms of the disease. We also have many, many small molecules, antibodies, and even some antisense oligonucleotides that are targeting targets for the sporadic ALS population. And I think as those trials mature, some of those may come to the expanded access program, certainly. We hope they do, because we hope that they continue to look promising.
I think I'll just add a couple of points. So it's clear, and James just highlighted one. There's several drugs targeting many different drug targets for sporadic ALS. Things like QRL201 for Stathman2, Zalud with XT150. So there's some
Amylyx trial that's also
with Calpain, AMX 0114, I think it is.
Yeah.
But they're early phase. So sometimes we're trying to make sure that we can address everyone's needs in terms of clinical trials, and hopefully allowing for expanded access to be broadly available. It is true that once you participate, actually, what I will just add a little note, it depends on the expanded access. So if you look at some of these ongoing expanded access programs, some of them allow you to participate in another program. So, really carefully look at the expanded access programs. But typically, if you finish one, normally people generally are able to participate in the next.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So the next question's for you as well. This one came up in multiple forums, so I want to address it directly. There are community members who have questions about whether EAPs are the best use of federal dollars compared to funding earlier stage trials. So how would you respond to that?
I think I kind of touched on it a little bit when I was talking about how early phase trials predominate our pipeline right now. And it's true. If we had our wish, right, and we had unlimited resources, would love to fund more basic science and would love to try to get better targets so we have better drugs in our pipeline. And what I want to point out is that the allocation of funds in Act for ALS does not take away from other programs, federally funded programs for basic science research. And there is $40 million sitting in DoD that's separate from Act for ALS money. There's NIH funding for basic science research that's separate from Act for ALS. And just to be out there and looking at the big picture, we've done pretty well as a community this year, hopefully. And, we never know what the future will hold, but we've been pretty good about preserving our basic science research dollars, as well as our clinical trial and early phase trial money, as well as and hopefully the Act for ALS money. I think that it's important. I get a lot of questions, especially from caregivers who've lost a loved one or people who have slower disease progression about like the cost, for EAP. It seems like a lot of money for just one expanded access program. So what I will say is that when you're looking at these expanded access programs, and the funds are openly available for everyone to look at, and even you can request information, which I've provided requests to people living with ALS who wanted to see the budgets. It's very important, and this is why I stress the fact that these are NIH-funded expanded access programs. I think is a misnomer. So it is true that you need safety and tolerability to open an IND for an investigational new drug. But when you write an NIH grant, it also undergoes a secondary review by scientists that are independent and even outside of ALS. So there's a panel that has to review it and approve, and they ask you lots of questions about the drug, about the scientific rationale, about the current up-to-date clinical development, like what's it done in ALS? Is it worthy of going forward? And is the budget reasonable? So there is a secondary level of review beyond FDA and NIH. So there's a lot of review that goes on. The dollars that are allocated, I just want to be clear, is not just a per patient fee. So if you do the math and you just say, oh, this program has 100 patients and there's such money, so I'm going to divide the number by 100. That is not an accurate representation of how the funding is used within that program. Think about it for a minute. Like I just told you about the EAP program, how we're looking at biomarkers. That in and of itself could have been one grant, separate from giving people expanded access. I'm testing predicted algorithms in my grant. That could have been a separate grant, separate from the expanded access, providing drug to somebody. I am collecting samples and clinical information and putting it into a centralized repository. That has a cost. And that could have been a separate research program, separate from giving somebody an investigational drug. So sometimes when I hear people asking, it's really, I know it's not clear. That's why we're doing this webinar, to really provide some granularity and detail to help understand the bigger picture. And the last is, All ALS is such a great program. We've been trying to do this for several years. I've been here 20 some odd years trying to see how we can kind of sustain biorepositories. We've been doing, James has been doing it for many, many years. And it's always hard to fund infrastructure and sustain kind of this massive, large scale repository. We need it. Cancer has done it. HIV has done it. We need it. And one of the things about the original legislation, which is it's so subtle, but I'll make a public point, is that it provided flexibility of how to use the dollars. So we can be prescriptive about how to use the dollars to ensure that all ALS is funded, but giving a little wiggle room so that they can kind of allocate monies that don't get used for EAPs for other research initiatives, basic science, natural history studies, observational studies, is something that's really important for us, because we need all the dollars. We don't need some of the dollars, we need all the dollars, and we need all the research. So when we're talking back Act for ALS, everyone has a knee-jerk reaction to expanded access, but that's not all Act for ALS is about.
Thank you. And we're at the top of the hour. We need to kind of wrap things up, but I do have a couple more questions I'd love to answer or have answered really quickly, and then we can close this out. And if we don't answer your question, we'll get to you. We'll follow up with you afterwards. So the next question, I would like to bring in Dr. Lewin-Farber. What can people living with ALS and their families do to help support reauthorization of the Act for ALS?
Well, people can get involved by talking to their congressional representatives and getting them to support the Act for ALS, getting involved with the ALS network, getting involved with I Am ALS, getting involved with ALS United, help spread this awareness through social media. Those are the things that we do, and that's what we recommend.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And one more question. This is for you, Allison, kind of building on what Dan just shared there. What advocacy work is currently underway to advance the interests of people living with ALS, and what difference will it make?
Thanks, Jerry. Good question. There are a lot of ways that advocacy is happening across the ALS community right now, but the major focus at this moment, if you couldn't tell, is the upcoming reauthorization of the Act for ALS, which prompted this webinar so that we could help people prepare to take action and be involved in advocacy. A lot of our time, like you heard, has been dedicated to making sure this hits the ground running. And over the past year, all of the community has come together to review what we've learned and make sure that the needs of the community are front and center in these discussions. However, I want to talk a bit more broadly about advocacy. Advocacy in the ALS space happens at multiple levels. It includes federal legislation and research funding, engagement with agencies like the FDA and CMS, and education for policymakers and other stakeholders who help to shape the decisions that impact our community. It also happens at a state and local level. State-based ALS organizations often work closely with their communities to advance policies that improve care and support. And in many cases, state initiatives that are successful in one state can serve as a model for others to follow. For example, we've seen advocacy lead to the creation of ALS registries across the country. And advocacy truly does make a difference. Just last year, when federal funding for key research across all disease states were at risk, advocates across the country spoke out, and they were loud and put pressure and made sure that their elected officials understood how critical that these programs are. As a result, and I'm very happy to say this, we saw an increased investment in the ALS research ecosystem and programs that directly support the community. And ultimately, the difference that advocacy makes is that it ensures that the people living with ALS and their families are reflected in every single decision that is made that shape research, care, and access to therapies, and to really help accelerate progress towards ultimately multiple cures, because we want to make sure that we end ALS together. So thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Allison. There is one more I just want to hit really quickly here. This is for Dr. Andrews and Dr. Berry. What is the realistic outlook for ALS becoming a manageable disease rather than a terminal one? And what can people expect in terms of timeline and actions from the new federal funding?
I mean, this is an exciting question to answer, because I think the answer is actually really different than it was some years ago, 5-10 years ago, because of the successes we've seen, and also because of the knowledge that we have about the disease. And that comes from basic research that's looking at cell models and looking at animal models, translational research that's looking at biofluids, like the biofluids that we're collecting in the EAPs and in all ALS, and taking the knowledge that we have from those models and then looking at it in humans, and incredible chemistry that's coming into clinical trials with drug targets that we found through all of our studies across humans and animal models and cell models and fish models and everything that you can think of. I really think it's very, very we have a straight line to imagine that we can come up with therapies that will make this disease slow its progression to a crawl. And we know that with the right chemistry and the right drugs and the right trials, we can find drugs that can actually even meet with some return of strength in people. And we know that we can improve on that. So being able to do that once means that it's just a matter of finding a way to do it for everybody living with ALS. And we're even now beginning to think about how do we prevent ALS in people that are at risk of it but don't have it yet.
Yeah, I think like the all ALS and natural history studies are things like where we can learn that kind of information. And what I will say is that we've learned a lot from our failed studies, actually. And just to put everything into perspective, really crystal clear, we're so excited about tofersen. Tofersen was a failed phase 3 study, just to be clear. I I think it's a wonderful drug. It has shown a benefit. We learned after the fact, and we did post hoc analyses, and we had an open label extension that gave us clinical data, and we saw the evidence of effect, but it took time. The Riluzole was a failed phase 3 study. Actually, Radicava hit its pre-specified phase 3 endpoint. So, just because a drug fails, and especially in sporadic ALS, one of the things that we've learned over time from our previous failed studies is that the disease is very different from person to person. There might be different mechanisms that are more predominant in some individuals with ALS versus another. And putting everybody in one big trial, in a phase 2 trial, and trying to figure out an answer might not be exactly what we may not come out the way we want it to. But then doing analyses and finding a signal and confirming it in a phase 3 is an important part of the step. And in oncology and HIV, sometimes the initial drugs were very modest and didn't make a big difference. And then with each small success in add-on therapy, you get bigger and bigger gains. They call that incremental gains. And eventually the game changer comes. So it's really important that we stay like a machine and keep pushing forward.
Thank you, Jency. And thank you to all of our panelists, Allison, Dr. Stacy, Dan, Jency, James, Andrea. We really appreciate it. I really want to thank the ALS Network for hosting this webinar. We appreciate that as well. And to everyone that's joining us here today, if you want to learn more about ALS United and the member organizations serving your community, you can visit us on our website at alsunited.org. And now I'll turn it back over to Steve to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. We are grateful to each of you for being a part of our community. And once again, a big thanks to all of our sponsors for their support. If you have any other questions that were not answered today, including questions about the services offered at the ALS Network, please email us at askme@alsnetwork.org. If you aren't already signed up, we invite you to become an ALS advocate by registering in our Advocacy Action Center at alsnetwork.quorum.us. For California taxpayers, you can directly support ALS research through your state income tax return by contributing to the California ALS Research Network Voluntary Tax Contribution Fund. Simply enter code 447 at the bottom of your California state tax return. Every dollar will help to contribute to our efforts to find treatments and cures for ALS. Please share this with everyone you know so they can help too. The ALS Network brings our community together in various ways throughout the year to create help and hope for families impacted by ALS today and for those who will be diagnosed in the future. These celebratory and meaningful gatherings provide opportunities for connection and raise awareness and funds to benefit ALS Network's mission priorities. Please visit events.alsnetwork.org to learn how you can join us. As you know, philanthropy fuels everything we do, and we are grateful to the generous donors who make gifts of all sizes throughout the year, including contributions through an estate plan. To learn more about how you can support valuable programs like this, please visit our website at give.alsnetwork.org. And please watch for the short survey on today's presentation that you'll receive via email in order to help us plan for future programming. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.